Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Kieran Setiya, who is a professor of philosophy at MIT and also the author of a number of books, including Knowing Right from Wrong and the two books I have with me right here, which are, addressed at a more wider, more popular audience than the typical academic philosophy audience. One is called Midlife, a philosophical guide. And the most recent one is called Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. Welcome, Kieran.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I think in the most recent book, you said something to the effect of philosophy and self-help. These things are one and the same. And I mean, that's a very ancient view of philosophy, but for some reason, these things have diverged, right? And, people typically don't think to go to academic philosophers for guidance on their everyday lives. They go to authors of what we call self-help books. And I'm wondering, should we think of those authors of self-help books as philosophers, right? It's kind of like when, in the world of music, there's a big debate about whether or not people who, write musicals for Broadway, is that a continuation of opera or is that, totally separate from opera? So, why is it that self-help and philosophy diverged? And are we starting to see them kind of come back together? Is philosophy turning back towards the question of how to live one's life?
A lot to unpack there. I'm tempted to start with the question about whether self-help writers are philosophers, and some I think self-consciously are, but there's the Keynes quote about how men of the world who claim not to be influenced by intellectuals are usually the unwitting follower of some past economist or philosopher. And so I think the self-help writers who are not self-consciously doing moral philosophy or thinking about ethics are implicitly doing it. And often when they're doing it implicitly without really thinking about it, they're not necessarily doing it very well. So I think there's a risk there of writing in a way that submerges the philosophical presuppositions of what you're doing. As to whether philosophy can be a form of self-help or how they're connected, I think that there's a tradition in ethics of thinking about how to live well that can inform how we live. I don't think everything in philosophy is like that. I don't think everything in ethics is like that. But I do think philosophical reflection and even contemporary philosophical reflection is often of practical use or can be of practical use. And one thing that I think is frustrating and a lot of my work is a response to is a failure of communication. That even quite cutting edge philosophical ideas often have these connections, and philosophers don't always draw them out. And I think you were pointing to the explosion of work by philosophers really in the last 10, 15 years that has been more public facing. So I do think philosophers are more conscious now than they were when I was in grad school of the need and the possibility of translating some of what they're doing for a wider audience.
But has your view of philosophy evolved over time? I think you said somewhere in one of your books that you began your life as a philosopher when you were like 7 or 8 years old. I can kind of identify with that. But you also said that at that point you at one point viewed philosophy as an escape from ordinary life. Do you still believe that? Because it seems like your work is implying that philosophy is something that you can do almost continuously, right, as you live your life.
I think people are. There are parts of philosophy that have a kind of escapist quality. There are questions in metaphysics that don't have any particular practical urgency, but I think are still intellectually valuable. They're kind of the equivalent of doing pure science or pure math or something. But I do think we're all implicitly engaging in, when we decide how to live our lives, with an activity that's continuous with moral philosophy, with ethics. In terms of the shift in how I think about philosophy, I suppose when I was learning how to be an academic philosopher, there was a very strong emphasis on how to make a rigorous argument, how to construct certain kinds of theory. And again, I think that has a place in philosophy. But I would say one thing that has enabled me or helped me to see the continuity between philosophy and a certain kind of self-help and the power of philosophy is thinking of description, attentive description, as a bigger part of the philosophical enterprise than I'd previously conceived it as being. And so one way to think about how we deal with a lot of the problems we face of grief, or what am I going to do in my midlife crisis? Part of what we need there is a description of what's happening that brings some order to our experience. And that task of like finding the right concepts, finding the right description is, I think, a necessary precondition, and often takes you a substantial part of the way towards figuring out, okay, this is how I should feel and maybe how I should orient myself. So I think one big shift has been thinking of philosophy as a little bit more of a descriptive enterprise, or at least including a descriptive enterprise, and not just about constructing these rather abstract kind of arguments designed to compel people to accept some theory.
Now, of course, you engage a lot of the classic philosophers in your work, and as with so many other things, we have to always go back to Aristotle. I mean, you go back further than Aristotle, but it seems like I don't think it's possible for me to have a podcast where Aristotle doesn't, pop up somehow, like, in the corner of the screen. He's always lurking. But I think you make the point that, while there's so much of value in Aristotle, he kind of set us on the wrong path here, right? His view of eudaimonia is one that is, fundamentally, I don't know, it's not that it's unrealistic, but that it's not even something that we should be pursuing, right? This idea of pure contemplation, right?
No, exactly. I mean, I think in the abstract, he asks a question that seems sensible, and you might think is going to be of great practical importance, which is, in effect, what's the ideal life? But he really asks, what's the ideal life? So if you could really forget all the practical exigencies that constrain human life, what would you want? What would you want to do? What should you want to do? And the answer is a certain kind of philosophical contemplation. And he could be right about that, but the disconnect is between answers to the question, what would be an ideal life detached from the actual practical constraints we face, and what am I going to do here and now in the conditions I'm in, which are always, to some degree, imperfect right now, maybe particularly challenging for many of us. And it's just not obvious at all. In fact, I think it's not true that the best way to answer the question, what should I do in my problematic circumstances, is, well, look at what an ideal life would be and just sort of aim towards that. And it's both impractical and often very bad advice. It's like, if someone said, well, you don't have any yeast, try to make some bread. You could think, well, what's the thing that's going to be most like a regular loaf of bread? Or you might think, yeah, that's not the right thing to aim for here. There's some more dramatic pivot in how I'm going to try to make a kind of bread-like thing. And I think that's a better analogy for the situation we're in when we try to think about what to do here and now, when ideals like Aristotle's are not really viable.
But it's not just that type of life is unattainable, but it's also kind of undesirable. I mean, when I try to think of a life where, food grew on trees, and everything was just, handed to me, and I was lying on a couch eating grapes. I mean, that just doesn't seem like the good life to me. And I think you're suggesting that a lot of the things that he's trying to offload as instrumental, they're actually sort of part of what constitutes a good life.
I mean, I think your point to is actually quite a subtle thing in Aristotle that I think he is confused about, really, which is he asks, like, what's the ideal life? And you might think, well, one thing it won't have is any of the kinds of needs or problems that we'd rather not deal with. So maybe we won't have to do the dishes, or people won't get a cold or something. Like, there's things that create problems, but we're not going to regret those needs or problems going away. But there's this category you're pointing to of needs or challenges that are genuinely needs or challenges, but not ones we'd rather live without. And that category is just not in clear focus in Aristotle. So an example of this is his very conflicted attitude to friendship. So you might think, well, as social animals, we need other people. But that's not one of the needs that in an ideal world would just go away. that's a need for sure, but it's not a need that I'd rather live without. Whereas for Aristotle, the status of friendship is extremely vexed, because ideally I could just unfortunately, I might need your help to contemplate. But ideally, I could just forget about you and contemplate all by myself. And so I think he's just not got the category you described in view.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your other book on midlife, it seems kind of embarrassing, right, for a professional philosopher to, admit to a midlife crisis, because it seems like, a midlife crisis occurs when someone, finally begins to reflect on, what it is that they're actually doing. And, we have this view of philosophers as, folks who are kind of doing this all the time, right? So how is it possible for a professional philosopher to, have what is conventionally called a midlife crisis?
That's a great question. I mean, I thought of the embarrassment. It's certainly embarrassing from the point of view of the stereotypes of a midlife crisis, which is buying a fast car and leaving your wife and things like that. So I was redirected happily by my wife into the more socially acceptable write a book about it strategy. Which is somewhat less embarrassing. But you're right that there's a kind of reflection here that I think it is to do, at least for me, with a kind of failure of integration between the kind of reflection I was doing as a philosophy professor and the kinds of questions that I was facing in my life. And it took work to reintegrate those. So I think this is maybe the point about argument and theory versus description is relevant here. There's a kind of attention to one's actual life that isn't emphasized as much in philosophy as it might be. So one thing I noticed when I was working on the midlife book was not just the midlife crisis. It was, if I actually look around, I'm talking to friends about questions that are recognizably ethical. What are they? And they're questions like, should I have kids? Should I not have kids? What kind of job? How do I balance making enough money in my job with doing a job that's fulfilling? Those questions are ones that philosophers have said some things about, but they're not, they're relatively marginal in the philosophical landscape. And the question of midlife is even more so. So I think that's a phenomenon of the kind of split between philosophy and self-help, the kind of tendency of philosophers to construct theories in a way that's detached from the fabric of their own lives, I think isn't a necessary feature of the philosophical enterprise.
But it's another way of just saying that, philosophers are people too, right? I mean, they get caught up in these, telic activities, right? Getting published and
yes,
so forth,
so I mean,
right?
there is so one of the key distinctions I draw in my discussion of midlife and kind of understanding my own midlife crisis is between what I call telic activities, where you've got a project with a definite endpoint and satisfactions in the future, and you're driven towards it. And right now, it's like, I'm not there yet, and I contrast that with these atelic activities like just thinking or walking or spending time with friends, where you're not aiming at something in the future that you don't yet have. So you don't have this sense of frustration or that when I'm done, what am I going to do next? You have the thing you want and value right now. And I think there is a tendency in the professional structure of philosophy, but I think this is just true of professional structures in general, to take things like, say, philosophical contemplation, which is atelic. It's, there are all kinds of endpoints within it, but in itself, it's not directed at a kind of final goal, and turn it in the course of professionalization into a sequence of activities like writing a book, write a paper, teach a class, get a promotion, and thereby distort your relationship to your own life into something that is very task focused. And I think that was being excessively task focused, project focused, is I think a kind of subtle way in which life can go wrong that became clear to me at that midlife point. And one way to kind of bring out how that might elude you is, part of what's puzzling is the tasks might be worthwhile and you might be doing them more or less successfully. So it's easy to think, well, I think this is worth doing. It's going pretty well. The next thing will be worth doing. That will go pretty well. How could something be fundamentally wrong with my life? Like, what more do I want? And there is a real conceptual work to do in trying to articulate how my values have been skewed in that kind of case.
But I mean, I think that you could potentially go too far in the other direction, right? And just say, what's the point of these telic activities, right? And just decide to completely check out, right? Be like Schopenhauer, right? I mean, why? I mean, it seems like you're arguing that you need to sort of have a balance, right? That, as you go through life, there's nothing wrong with having goal-oriented things that you can sort of check off the list, as long as you are not completely absorbed in that treadmill.
That's exactly right. Yes, I think I'd been tempted at times when I was first thinking about this by the more extreme view, the view that there's something regrettable about this goal structure that involves a kind of frustration and then a sense of emptiness when you're done. And when you're pursuing a project, you're sort of, in a way, undermining something meaningful in your life by trying to finish it. And so I was tempted by the thought, well, maybe we'd be better off without that. But I think this connects to the point you made about Aristotle earlier, namely, you can acknowledge that there's something unfortunate about goals, or a kind of deficiency in their structure, without thinking, well, we just be in an ideal world, that would just all go away. So I think you're right, that in an ideal world, we would still see value in getting things done, but also value in processes that are not so goal-directed.
Right. And I think you use this term mindful, right? I mean, this pops up in your work in multiple places. And, what does that mean actually to be mindful? I think a lot of people think, oh, okay, you carve out some time for meditation, and then you go and do that, and then you check that box, right? So, it's like 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Got to do my meditation, and then I can go back and enter the fray. I mean, what does it mean to be mindful?
That is a good question and a very hard question. I mean, one thing, let's put a pin in the relation to this to actual Buddhism, about which I have kind of tentative views. But the way I was thinking about it, there is this feature that whenever you're doing anything, you're both doing telic activities and atelic activities. And the question is, what are you attending to? Where are you seeing value? So you're recording this episode, you're going to finish this episode, you'll get it out. But you're also just talking to people, thinking about questions that interest you. So you're doing both. And the question is, where is your evaluative focus? Do you value both? Is it shifting almost exclusively towards just like getting this episode done, which would be purely telic? And I think of mindfulness as, in the sense that seems ethically significant here, as a matter of being able to appreciate and value the atelic in what you're doing while you're doing it. So the relation of that to things like mindfulness meditation, as I practice mindfulness meditation, is it's a kind of extreme attempt to kind of silence the project-driven, forward-looking part of your proclivity and appreciate very simple atelic activities, just breathing, sitting, listening, the noises around you. And the thought is that you then take that capacity into the rest of your life so far as possible. But yeah, it's not... It's sort of not self-contained in that way.
Right. So it's like, you're reading a book, but you're reading, right? I mean, cooking is my favorite example is cooking, because I cook a lot. And I don't think of myself sometimes I think of myself as making a meal, but most of the time I think of myself as cooking, right? And then the meal sort of happens. And so it's funny, when I'm trying to get people to come on the podcast, a lot of people I've had on the podcast have never been on a podcast before, and they're very suspicious. And so sometimes I'll say, instead of let's record a podcast, I'll say, look, let's just have a conversation. And then at some point, and just we'll leave the, recording device on in the background. And then at some point we'll just turn it off, and they'll be like, oh, okay, I can do that. But it's the same thing. It's just sort of the way you're inhabiting it, right?
No, I think that's exactly right. Another example of this that is very salient to me is parenting, where it's very easy to get caught up in the next thing, helping your kid with their homework, getting them to school, making the lunch. And there's this series of tasks, and they really do matter. It matters if your kid doesn't get lunch. It matters if they miss school. So it's not that there's no value in those things, but it's very easy to sort of experience this as a grind of one thing after another, and to lose track of the fact that part of what you value is just this ongoing relationship of parenthood that is not aimed at any kind of completion. You're not trying to finish parenthood. It will change and it will take different forms, but it's not completable in that way. So that's another kind of case where I think this sort of shift can be a way of understanding the value of what you're doing that is easy to miss in the bustle of necessary tasks.
Well, it seems like another thing that you realized more fully or able to articulate better was this notion that as you go through life, you are foreclosing options, right? You know, I mean, I'm a finance guy, so like, you know, every, as time passes, the options expire. But, you know, you're also creating options, right? As you go through life. And I think you had a very profound point, which was that, and I forget who you were quoting, maybe you were quoting yourself, but something to the effect that, you know, if you don't foreclose options, then you don't have any ballast, right? You don't have any self, right? So midlife seems to be about, I guess, recognizing all the options that have been foreclosed and mourning them to some extent, right?
I think that's right. I mean, I think one thing I would say about the midlife crisis is that there are many midlife crises. So some of it has to do with the sense that I've become very task oriented and I'm not seeing the value of just the process of what I'm doing right now. There's also kind of past directed challenges like the one you're pointing to, where I look back and think I had all these options before, and now my life is sort of narrowed, and I'm never going to be a musician, or I'm never going to be a doctor, and I'm never going to not have kids, or I'm never going to have kids, or whatever the kind of alternatives that at a certain point were available to you are. And it's easy to be filled with a certain kind of regret, even if things have gone quite well. I mean, there's also, I talk about in another part of the book, regret when things haven't gone well. But even when things have gone well, it's not that you think things would have been better another way. Just the sheer fact that your life has a certain shape means that you're going to miss out on things. And that's something that goes from being an abstract future prospect to a concrete lived reality for most of us, you know, as we get older, middle age and later. And I do think there's a kind of philosophical point about what's going on there, which is what this reflects is a certain kind of value pluralism. Like there are certain kinds of decisions where you make choices that it doesn't make sense to regret. If someone says, do you want $50 or $100? You take the $100 and you don't think, I pine for the $50 I could have had. It's sort of commensurable. But most decisions we face are not like that. You decide you're going to read this book, not that book, or you go to this concert rather than staying home. And the thing you miss out on is valuable in a different way than the thing you get. And so it's true that a consequence of that will be this experience that almost inevitably, in fact, basically inevitably, you're going to miss out on certain things about which it's totally appropriate to feel regret. It's just that the alternative to that would be such a radical impoverishment. The only way you could avoid being that kind of person would be to not be capable of valuing a variety of different things, or for the world to be so impoverished that there's just no diversity of things worth wanting. And so on balance, we can't reasonably want that. So we have to, in a way, sort of embrace the fact that regret is just is a function of something that's not at all regrettable, namely the diversity of value.
But it seems like the remedy for that oftentimes is like a form of, I guess, personal theodicy, right? Where you say, well, you know, if I hadn't done what I did, then I wouldn't have what I have, and therefore it's all for the best. I mean, that seems like an act of self-deception that a lot of people will engage in, right? I mean, is there a way to kind of embrace one's decisions without falling prey to this self-deception?
I think so, yes. So I think there's the case where things have turned out well and it wouldn't have been better, it just would have been different. The case you're thinking about is one where I think, you know, surely a cold, hard look at the situation will be one on which, if I hadn't made that terrible mistake, my life would have gone better. Or, you know,
maybe like, for instance, you said, you know, I wouldn't have my kid, but, you know, maybe you would have had a better one. Right?
Exactly. So I think there's a phenomenon here, which, I mean, there's a kind of judgment call about whether it is rational, but I think it's reasonable, and it's a deeply human phenomenon, which is not, it doesn't actually involve saying, yeah, I had this kid, I couldn't have had a better kid. Like maybe if I had married someone else and had some other kid, my life would have gone better. So it's not that I need to be under an illusion about whether it would have gone better. It's more that the phenomenon of attachment to an actual individual, like love of my kid, puts me in a position where I think, well, I quite reasonably would rather be in the situation I am and where my kid exists, who I love, than some alternative life that might well have been better. And I think that's one thing to notice is that attachment does psychologically play that role for us. I think it's reasonable. There's no compelling argument that that's unreasonable. And the question is just how far does that phenomenon extend? And one thing I argue in the Midlife book is that it extends from both it extends beyond the case of having a kid, where I think a lot of parents will be able to go through this imaginative exercise of saying, well, lots of things have gone badly, but if I hadn't made those decisions, I'd never have met my partner, we'd never have had this kid, so I can't really regret them. I think there's a similar kind of imaginative exercise that involves attachment not to the existence of a particular human being, but just to the specifics of the people around us whose existence doesn't depend on us, but we wouldn't know them otherwise, or to the activities we engage in. And I think that kind of human attachment is no less reasonable than the kind of loving attachment we have for particular children whose lives wouldn't otherwise exist.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this thing that you describe as midlife, I mean, this could potentially happen at any point in your life. And presumably, I mean, you could inoculate yourself against this, right? And what would such an inoculation look like? I mean, I like to joke that I had my midlife crisis when I was, 21. I don't know, because I don't really know exactly. But I mean, is there a way that one can embrace the choices that one makes more consciously, right? I mean, young people now always talk about FOMO, and I think the FOMO has percolated upwards, and now you even have, senior citizens with FOMO. I mean, is there a way that people can embrace the choices that they're making when they're making them, and be aware of the price that they're paying, or the trade-offs that are naturally flow from those decisions?
I think so. I mean, it's funny you should say that you had this earlier, because I do think you could. When I was talking about this project to a friend, they were like, "You're going through that now? I went through that when I was in college." Mill.
Yeah, Mill. I mean, what was Mill? Like 21?
Yeah, John Stuart Mill had this accelerated upbringing.
I totally identified with Mill when I was like that age.
So I think you could have it then, or you could have it later in life. And some people don't think in these terms, but I think the problem itself is part of the temporal structure of human life, and the fact that it takes is finite and takes a determinate shape, and that's just something you could realize at any point. I think the way, insofar as I have an answer to how to work through it, the way I think about it is, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, where there's you're having feelings that depend on kind of a certain way of seeing the world. And your therapist works with you to say, well, is that really a reliable way of seeing the world? Is there really good evidence that people don't like you? Or is it just that you tend to kind of have those negative thoughts? You could think of some of what I'm doing here as a kind of philosophical cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea is there's certain kinds of mistaken thoughts that we're very strongly prone to, and they come with feelings. So if we think the only way to not feel bad about my life is to think I couldn't have had a better life, I'm going to feel bad about it. If I recognize that, no, it's reasonable to be attached to a particular form my life has taken without pretending that it couldn't have been better, I can see that makes sense. I'm going to be prepared emotionally for that kind to not experience that particular kind of negative feeling about my life. So I think, in a way, the prescription is philosophical. It's try to work through these philosophical distinctions and ideas in a way that is a kind of prophylactic against a kind of cognitive error, cognitive illusion, philosophical cognitive illusion. I think there's a hard question here, which applies to cognitive behavioral therapy too, which is, how far does the cognitive kind of penetrate through to one's emotional life? Because you can sometimes be in a position where you think, I understand this intellectually, but emotionally, I'm not. I still have these recalcitrant feelings, and that's a kind of further challenge, I think.
Well, now another trap I think that people like my colleagues fall into, and myself sometimes, is this idea of trying to reduce everything to, a single objective function, right? And as people who are trained in utilitarianism, I mean, utilitarianism has sort of moved from being a social welfare maximizing enterprise to an individual life satisfaction maximizing enterprise. And you quote, I guess was it Plato who said this is living the life of a mollusk, right? So like, why is that so appealing and attractive? Why is it sort of taken over the popular way of looking at life, and why is it deficient?
That is a very interesting question. I think there's a kind of high level part of the answer which has to do with the attraction of simple formulas. So, and this applies to self-help literature. I think it's part of why, say, Stoic philosophy has been explosively popular in self-help, because to a first approximation, you can summarize a kind of key Stoic idea in a slogan, which is worry about the stuff that's under your control, detach completely from what isn't. Boom. This will address many, many problems in your life. And there's just a deep desire when you're dealing with difficulties in life to avoid difficulty. So a simple solution is attractive. So one attraction of say, hedonistic utilitarianism is, well, what makes an individual life good? Pleasure good, pain bad, add it up. How should I live my life? Maximize that. Maximize it in aggregate. And it's extraordinarily simple and elegant. And so that's part of the appeal. And I think the ways in which it goes wrong have partly to do with just a kind of substantive failure of that way of thinking about the good life. So philosophers are very fond of these thought experiments where people are plugged into deception machines, experience machines, or virtual realities in which you manipulate things so that their balance of pleasure over pain is terrific. But they don't seem to be living a great life because they're not actually achieving or doing most of the things they think they're doing. They're not having genuine relationships with other people. So I think there are thought experiments like that can bring out what's wrong with hedonism as a view about the good life or human well-being. But what's wrong with utilitarianism comes down to making judgments about particular cases in which it seems to give the wrong verdict. And you have to be willing to kind of tolerate the fact that if you buy those judgments and reject utilitarianism, your ethical thinking is going to be messy in a way that it won't be if you have this simple slogan. And that is a kind of difficulty for people.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that John Stuart Mill came to this realization when he was 21. And I think a lot of people sometimes come later in life, and some people never come to this realization. But for some people, when they find that this is unsatisfying, right, this idea of maximizing their own pleasure, they'll simply replace it with, oh, I got to maximize other people's pleasure too. And, and that has always seemed to me to be kind of circular, right? Like, if I'm maximizing your pleasure and you're maximizing my pleasure, how does that actually change anything, right? I mean, why do people feel like that is a satisfactory solution to the limitations of, a hedonistic view?
Yeah, no, I do think there's a kind of confusion here that there's a kind of paradox of altruism, as it were, that if all you're doing is sort of devoting your energy to helping other people and solving problems, like, what's the point of any of it? Like, unless there's something that makes life worth living that isn't just problem solving, it looks like all we can do is sort of cancel out the negatives and get up to zero. And that doesn't seem like we've got in view any way to live a good life at all. And there's another distinction that I think is really crucial. And this is another thing that I think Aristotle is sort of onto but murky about, is this distinction I draw between ameliorative and existential value, which is the distinction between things that are genuinely worth doing, but because they solve problems or regrettable needs. And if that's all we're focused on, it's hard to see what the point of it all is. Like, unless there's something that's positively good, why are we living our lives at all? And then what I call existential value, which is the kinds of things that are worth doing that aren't ameliorative. They don't just solve a problem. And so one kind of distortion we can kind of fall into here that sort of, in a way, admirable, is recognizing the urgency of fulfilling people's needs and thinking, well, in the short term, like, that should have absolute priority, can lead us to have a kind of conception of how to live in which we've just excised this question of like what are the positive goods in a way that when we step back from it makes us realize we can't see why we're doing any of this at all. And that, I think, is one of the problems that Mill was grappling with when he had his nervous breakdown at 20. Was he was determined to be a reformer, a utilitarian, to reduce human suffering, and then what? Like, and so I think it comes from in a way a good place, which is thinking about the urgency of solving, kind of addressing injustice and addressing human need.
Yeah, but it seems like, after Christianity, we don't really know what kind of sense to make of suffering, right? I mean, I have a friend who's deeply Christian, and when I see her suffering, I'm like, well, why don't we take some steps to alleviate your suffering? And her view is, well, how do we know, right? How do we know that I should be getting rid of the suffering as opposed to, digging into it, right? Like, and it seems like without the language of Christianity, we don't really know what to make of suffering, right? I mean, what's the point of it, right? Does it serve any purpose? Should we just strive to minimize it? And I think your view is a little more nuanced. I mean, as someone who is suffering from physical pain, chronic physical pain, I think a lot of people who are disabled, if you could wave a magic wand, I've heard about people who are deaf, and they say, I don't want treatment to get rid of my deafness because that's sort of what makes me who I am. I mean, how should we be thinking about suffering in sort of a post-Christian world?
I mean, I think the main thing to say is, from my point of view, is that is part of attentiveness to reality, and sort of is, if we're really not in that religious kind of constellation, is that we shouldn't pretend that we're going to get the same kind of consolation or the same kind of redemption, that we're just not going to get the answer, well, everything happens for a reason, because we've sort of given up on that. So we have to think in relation to suffering, well, there isn't any guarantee that this is all going to be for the best, but so it may well be that the right way to feel about this involves some, sadness, involves pain. That's not a sign that anything has gone wrong. And in some cases, I think people already recognize that it's not like when you're grieving someone who has died, you think, well, this is painful. It will be so much better if I just didn't feel anything. Like, that people recognize that this is not a case where that kind of suffering would just put you out of contact with reality. So I think that's a more general thought, that we need to be in contact with reality. There's value in being in contact with reality in itself, but also that it's the first step towards being able to figure out how should I feel and what should I do, where that's not likely to take the form of, here's a magic bullet, here's a magic solution. It's going to take the form of thinking, well, how do I, what kinds of ways can I still manage to live a good life despite this? And I will say, this is a kind of a long answer, but I'll say one more thing about it. I think that the case of pain and the case of physical disabilities are sort of somewhat different here, although they're connected. Because I think in the case of pain, I think most people would say, yeah, wave a magic wand, get rid of it, sure. But the question is, like, given that this is a fixed point, or if it becomes a fixed point, is that incompatible with having a good life? Probably, if I'm lucky, not. It's just going to be a different kind of good life with some negatives in it. In the case of disability, I think something is going on that's more continuous with what all of us live with, which is all of us live partial lives. All of us are living a life in which whatever a good life comes to, it's not a complete life. It's not a life in which all of the things you could do that are meaningful are being done. So it's got to be possible, if anyone is to have a good life, that you can have a good life while large parts of what matters are just not part of it. And the case of physical disabilities really just, unless it becomes very kind of wide-ranging, is just an instance of that, a kind of stark instance of that, where there's certain aspects of things that are genuinely valuable that you just don't have access to. But so long as there's enough other things that are valuable that you do have access to, you can have a good life. And then the kind of attachment things we talked about earlier will kick in, and you'll be like, well, look, the relevant question for me is not, could I, in principle, have had some better life slightly differently? It's that this is the shape my life has taken, and I'm attached to the specifics of it. And that's, again, a perfectly reasonable kind of attachment to have. So I think under this kind of pluralistic view about what human life is, on which it's always partial, it's always falling short in certain directions, or it has certain limitations, I think we can begin to see both how to think about physical disabilities in a way that is less sort of patronizing, I think, and also how to think about what kinds of aspirations we can reasonably have to a good life while living in conditions of chronic pain or chronic suffering of some kind.
Yeah, so you talk about the good enough life, but I mean, it's hard to know the difference between sort of contentment and complacency, right? I mean, how does one know whether, one's satisficing is simply laziness, right? Or, I don't know, brainwashing.
I don't have a good answer to that question in a way, or kind of, there's no simple principle for that. I think that's a great question. Like, I think if you're thinking, well, what is good enough? Can I be sure I'm not kidding myself about that? And really hard question. Maybe there's two parts to it, though. One is the kind of sour grapes phenomenon. So is my willingness to accept this a kind of adaptive preference, namely a case where I'm not responsive to what's actually valuable, I'm just kidding myself about it? And there, I think there's no simple formula, but we can think about whether we're just mistaken in seeing what we're missing out on as having value. Are we pretending that what we're missing out on just doesn't have value at all? There's a Virginia Woolf quote in the Midlife book that I love, where she's talking about not having kids. And she says, never pretend the things you don't have are not worth having. So I think we can reflect on whether we're making that kind of mistake. But even if we're not making that kind of mistake, there's still the question, well, how good is good enough? And I don't know that there's a kind of one size fits all answer to that. I think this is there's a kind of issue here that I don't know how to quite kind of pin down. There's a kind of echo of this in Stoicism. So Stoics have this idea that there's virtue is the key thing for eudaimonia, and nothing else really matters for eudaimonia. But there are all these what they call preferred indifference. So all the other stuff you might want, it's reasonable to want it, but you should want it in a kind of detached, like, it would be a bonus kind of way. And I think, while I'm not a Stoic, and I don't think they draw that line in the right way, I think they're right that there is some kind of line here that has to do with sort of moderation and greed, in effect, of thinking, at a certain point, if your life is good enough, you look at all the other things you could have, and the right attitude to have to them is something like, well, it would be great if I had that, sure. But the idea of being angry that I don't, or feeling like this is unacceptable that I don't, is just not a virtuous, for want of a better word. It's not a reasonable, justifiable response.
So I'm okay with hamburger, but, filet mignon would be nice, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But it still doesn't answer the question of, how much effort should I put into getting that?
No. I mean, yeah. So, and I think that's, in a way, I think on this sort of, once you've drawn this Stoic distinction, the two questions, the question of how I should feel and what I should do sort of come apart. So the thought would be, look, I've got enough to eat. It's perfectly pleasant. I'm not going to be furious about my situation. But does that mean I don't have any desire or motive to get the filet mignon or, become a wonderful chef? No, I may desire it, and I can act on that desire. It's just I'll do it with a kind of detachment from how things work out that sort of emotionally protects me. So I think there's room for a view that says, yeah, keep striving for all those things. All those things, strive for the ideal, or actually it won't really be the ideal, but like the best that's available in the circumstances. By all means, go for it, but do it in a way that does not involve a sense of injustice or unacceptability if what you end up with is just kind of what human beings have to can reasonably expect a life to look like. Now,
you also talk about future bias, and I don't think if most people would think of it as a bias, but it is a bias, right? Where if I were to say to you, Kieran, if you suffer like a lot in the next hour, we'll erase, 30 hours of suffering that you experienced last year, right? You probably wouldn't take that deal, but why not? I mean, why is it that once the suffering has passed, we kind of we're okay with it? I mean, we might even be proud of having survived it, right?
Yeah, no, this is a kind of very pervasive phenomenon that, that Derek Parfit in his book Reasons and Persons has an example where you wake up in hospital disoriented and the doctor says, oh yeah, I had two patients. One had a very long, painful surgery yesterday. The other has a short, painful surgery coming up today. I can't remember which one you are. And you're crossing your fingers thinking, I hope I had a really long, painful surgery because it will be in the past. And so I do think there's, at least in relation to pleasures and pains, so sort of things we experience. Again, it's just, I think, a fact about how human emotional life works, that we are biased in this way. We're very focused on future pleasures and pains in a way that we're not on past pleasures and pains. It's specific to pleasures and pains, though. So interestingly, we're not, most of us, future biased in this way with respect to achievements we don't experience. So if someone said, look, people are going to really love this podcast, or they're going to love one of your podcasts. It's either one of the past ones or one of the future ones, but they'll just admire you from a distance. You might think, well, I'd rather be admired more. If I'm not going to experience it, whether it's in the past or the future is neither here nor there. So I think there's something specific about our relationship to our own stream of consciousness that makes us future biased. Then there's the question, like, is that rational? Is there any rationally defensible story about that? And I think there probably is. I think it has to do with the way in which imagination and sort of anticipation just work differently for experience, where we can project ourselves into it, and for just facts about what happens to us where we can't. So I think it's reasonable to be future biased in that way, but I'm not sure it. I think people have wanted to sort of exploit the idea that so one kind of philosophical interest in this idea of future bias is the idea that if we could show that it was irrational, we might be able to say something about the rationality of fear of death, because we might be able to say, well, if it's most of us are very distressed when we think about the idea of going out of existence in the future and all the experiences we'll never have. But we look back with total equanimity at the fact that before we were born, we didn't exist, and there was all this giant stretch of time in which we weren't having experiences. And one kind of story about what's going on there is, well, that's an instance of future bias. And if future bias is irrational, maybe we can somehow convince ourselves that we should either be much more worried about prenatal non-existence, or more optimistically, that we should be more relaxed about post-mortem non-existence. We should feel about it more the way we feel about prenatal non-existence. I mean, I think that's an interesting line of argument. Because I'm not convinced that future bias is irrational, I don't really buy it. I'm more moved by an argument that connects with the issue about moderation, namely that when you really think about fear of death, and you're thinking, well, what's the alternative? The alternative would be not dying, meaning living forever. And it might be reasonable to think, I wish I could live forever. The same way you might think, I wish I could fly. But living forever would be kind of like a superpower. And while you might idly wish to have a superpower, the idea of feeling like grief-stricken or terrified, that kind of emotional response seems disproportionate to the fact that I'm not superhuman. And so that feels to me like it has more traction in bringing out something kind of puzzling in the way we think about death, and the extent to which at least some of us are emotionally invested in not dying.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm keen on immortality, but I want to live at least as long as needed to read all the books that I have in my house.
Immortality is a long time, right? Yeah, it seems excessive. Yeah.
Except people keep publishing new books. But you also talk a bit about our desire for autonomy. And, you pose a hypothetical where, you get everything you want, but you didn't have any choices, right? It was just kind of forced onto you, right? And how dissatisfying that would be, right? And, the extreme case is the underground man who just sort of says, well, I'm just going to choose to, do self-destructive things and, random irrational things just to make it clear that I'm the person in charge. I mean, is this also somewhat irrational? I mean, if you could, if you have a list of, here are all things I want, and your life is orchestrated so that you have no other path but the one that takes you exactly to where you said you wanted to get to, you wouldn't be happy with that.
I think there's something really puzzling about our valuing of choice in contexts like this. So a kind of abstract way to bring it out is that, if you three options, A, B, C, and you're told you're just going to get A or B or C, and you're like, well, A is best, B isn't as good, C is a little bit worse. And you're like, I'm hoping I get A. If someone then says, well, hold on, I got a new deal for you. You could also have a choice between B and C. There's a question, it's one thing to value options, but would it be reasonable to value options so much that you're now thinking, oh, wow, now you've added the choice element, even though I thought A was best, B was worse, C was worse. If I get to choose between B and C, that's even better. And I find that puzzling. I mean, I can see a certain kind of, well, people want what they want response in which you just say, yeah, I mean, if people love choice that much, why not choose the thing that independent of the choice, a choice between options that independently you would have thought were worse than the thing you don't even get a chance for. But I do think there's something irrational about valuing choice that much. So I don't have a worked out theory of the value of choice, but I think this sort of constraint, in some way or other, our valuing of choice has to be constrained so as not to be self-destructive in a way that we're choosing or we're preferring more choices in a way that makes our life worse in ways that we would sort of independent of choice have evaluated it. I think there's a puzzle there. That what I say in Midlife about this is just, here are some constraints and observations. It's a bit puzzling. Actually working out a theory of the value of choice that meets those constraints is sort of I think would be a philosophical challenge.
Now you quoted Iris Murdoch, who said something like, philosophy is at once a introspective exercise, right, where you're getting to know, you're figuring out your temperament, and also, about the external world, right, discovering truth, and presumably also goodness and beauty. I mean, do you see philosophy? I mean, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing, but it makes it a very different enterprise from what we typically think of as philosophy, which is concerned with the latter. To what extent does philosophy require that you understand the self, right, and understand one's temperament and understand, one's almost, physicality?
Yeah, I mean, I do love this. This is a Murdoch. I have a podcast where it's sort of built partly around this Murdoch quote of she says, to do philosophy is at the same time to explore one's temperament and attempt to discover the truth. And I think there's something deeply right about that. It does raise a kind of anxiety, which is, insofar as my subjective temperament is influencing my philosophical work, how can I be discovering the truth? Isn't that distorting? Isn't what I'm doing becoming a kind of confessional or autobiographical self-exploration rather than the truth-directed enterprise I thought it was going to be? My sense is that the right way to think about that is she's both drawing attention to a risk, and that your temperament can have that kind of distorting influence, but also is open to the idea that some temperaments are right and others are wrong, as it were. So part of what she's thinking is, there are aspects of being in tune with reality that we will have to think of as in a certain way temperamental. They're about, your the emotional priors, as it were. I don't know if people in your podcast have, there's this sort of picture in which you when you're doing assigning probabilities to things, you start out with these prior probabilities that like what you think is plausible, and then the evidence comes in and you adjust accordingly. And there's this debate in epistemology, like are some prior probabilities, just sort of initial sense of what's plausible, are some of those more right than others? And I think the Murdochian view is in ethics or in one's emotional life too, we come with different predispositions. And in a way, they're just given. But that doesn't mean that none of them are more reasonable than others. So it may be that even though philosophy is in a way an exploration of temperament, we should think of temperament as something that ideally doesn't detract from the reasonableness or the truth-seekingness of our inquiry. There's a way in which, and I think in ethics, this thought is not so alien. The thought would be, if you're going to someone for advice about ethical questions and you're asking, are they going to be reliable about it? You're going to be thinking, well, are they a good listener? Are they good at taking in what I'm saying? What kind of character do they have? And that won't be in opposition to, are they going to help me figure out the truth about this? They will sort of seem aligned.
But it seems like the verb explore is inadequate to describe what's happening, because it seems like there's a feedback loop, right? And one is simultaneously exploring, but also shaping one's temperament. And that there is something we might call a philosophical temperament that you develop as you engage in this practice, right?
Yeah, no, I like that point. Right? I think explore suggests it's absolutely given, as opposed to you come with a temperament and now you're engaging with philosophical or ethical questions and with other people. And one thing that might be changing is how you feel about things, and therefore how you see the next questions that you're faced with. I think that's totally right. Yeah, there is a feedback there. And I think the quote sort of obscures that.
Yeah, so I think self-help at its best is really about, I guess as Aristotle said, it's about, acquiring habits and developing temperaments and dispositions. So, last question I have for you is, you're teaching philosophy at MIT, right? MIT's not known for its, it has amazing, humanities, but to the outside world, it's seen as
STEM
sort of
school.
STEM school. So to what extent, should we be thinking about incorporating philosophy into our education all the way down? I know certainly in my life, reading philosophy at a young age was absolutely foundational, right? Critical to the development of myself as a person. And yet it's kind of seen as optional, luxury. If everybody's studying engineering and everybody's studying math and people are focusing on accounting and so forth. And then philosophy is sort of an elective. And there's probably not that many philosophy majors, and they're the ones that are consuming most of these courses. To what extent should we be thinking about making philosophy absolutely essential and foundational in our education, even in, say, high school?
I would love philosophy to be taught in high school or really earlier. I think people are asking.
It is in France, by the way. I think in France.
And I think there people have kind of philosophy in goes to school projects in the US. This has been a kind of outreach thing, but it's not part of the regular curriculum. And I think, honestly, before high school, kids are often very open to asking these kinds of open-ended philosophical questions. I think that's very important. I think at the college level, I think it's not just philosophy. I think it's also social sciences, it's history. I think philosophy, if you think of it as sort of continuous with attention to the world around you, there's just a certain amount of fact, like just understanding the history of the circumstance you're in and how social change works, that is part of making philosophy useful. I think all of those things are really essential. And I think early in this conversation, I probably misquoted Keynes on the idea that if you're not consciously doing philosophy and social science and history, you're unconsciously doing it badly. And I think that's one way to explain why it's so important for people to engage with philosophy early on and in conjunction with STEM. So just MIT has many wonderful things about it, but one feature of having a school that's so STEM focused is that it's very focused on technological solutions, and those can have great value. But it's very prevalent at MIT for students, without even really thinking about it, to find themselves kind of imbibing and sharing a kind of ideology, a kind of social political philosophy on which the way that social change happens is we innovate, and then the market somehow just takes care of everything. And that isn't how society works. I think that's just a kind of apolitical and naive conception of social change. But it can seem almost like it's not, it's because it's not really conceptualized or interrogated, I think, directly. Students can sort of think of themselves as apolitical, just doing the work of STEM, where in fact the way they're doing it is as I said, sort of in service to a dubious philosophical conception, a dubious social conception. And so, yeah, that's why I think at places like MIT in particular, it's really crucial for students' education to be integrated with the humanities, social sciences.
But would that require the academic research focus of philosophy departments to shift more in the direction of ethics and moral philosophy? Because, I mean, it would be difficult to have someone, I mean, even though it's all about, as you say, the art of argument, I mean, it would be difficult to have someone who is very narrowly focused on, say, philosophy of language to do, say, an intro course on ethics, right? I mean, would we need to sort of expand or alter the focus of academic philosophy to make it more accessible?
I mean, I think that to an extent this is already happening. If you this is partly due to compression in the academic job market, but it's true right now that like most of the jobs for philosophers at PhD level philosophers are in fact either in moral political philosophy or in people who are doing more applied parts of philosophy of language, like propaganda or code words, or people who are doing more applied parts of epistemology, like social epistemology. So I would not want us to abandon pure inquiry, but I think that shift is appropriate and salutary. And I think that it requires shifts in philosophy of other kinds too, namely, I think, philosophy that is more integrated with history and the social sciences, I think is going to be more able to play the kind of role we're now talking about than philosophy that is, more a priori and foundational. So I think those things are all valuable. But the problem we face, I think, is that there are all these extra demands, and they're coming at a time when resources are being reduced rather than expanded. So the fundamental challenge is, how do you, given the university landscape in the US or the high school landscape, or where funds for education are not going to be in rich supply, how do you do more things without making very painful cuts elsewhere? And I think that is a kind of dilemma we face in philosophy right now in the academy. Yeah,
well, in business schools, we have our research faculty and we have our kind of professors of the practice, right? And so, who focus on teaching. And so, that could be one solution, for better or worse, that would
I think there will be pressure to go that way, to sort of figure out how to do more with less, in effect.
Well, Kieran, thanks so much for joining me. The book, most recent book, is called Life is Hard. Most of us, I think, appreciate that. And it's another one called Midlife. I'm ready for the sequel, which will be Late Life, right? Let's crank that one out, and I'll go buy it. Thanks so much.
I'll go as quick as I can. Thank you so much for having me.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.